Might is a very useful word, right? Might is a very, I guess in a sense, a positive word. It was very useful when I was raising my kids because sometimes they would ask to do things that you couldn't do right then, so we might do it. It's also a good bargaining word too, right? If you do your homework, we might get ice cream. Or, it's often used when you can't do things right away. So we might do it. Things get better, we might be able to do more. And then that word follows us into adulthood. If the company does well, we might get a bonus this year. And then that bargaining chip, right? If you work a little harder, you might get a raise. Of course, we can always say, too, if the government learned to communicate, they might, well, never mind. But as Catholic Christians, we have to know that we are saved by God's grace. Paul tells us in the second reading that God's grace is a free gift to us, that He gives it to us. Whether we deserved it or not, God gave His gift of grace to us. It's like Paul is telling us that God looked at us, and He looked at Jesus, and He chose us. And then Jesus looked at us, and He looked at His Father, and He said, "You're right." You see, God's love is that grace that saves us, right? And that's something that we have in common with our Protestant brothers and sisters. But the problem is that we don't often celebrate what we have in common as much as we argue about where we differ. And where we differ is how we show our acceptance of God's grace. And where we differ is how we believe in expressing to others that we have accepted God's grace. But how do we accept it, right? Do we actually show, or do we actually really embrace the love of God in our lives? See, I don't know about y'all, but I'm still a sinner. And I know I have a lot of work left to do. A lot of changes left to make within my life. And you see, then we go to the gospel. The gospel tells us, and I'm going to read it to you again, that verse 3, John 3:16, right? We've seen it all over the place. They usually show it at sporting events. And I even saw one time an athlete had the little eye things under his eyes, and they had John 3:16 written on it. But I want to read it to you again. Because it says, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, so that everyone who believes in Him might not perish and might have eternal life." I'm going to venture to say that most of us miss that word might in that verse. You see, because it's not depending on what God does. God has given us His grace. God has given us His love. Whether we deserve it or not, He has given it freely to us. But how have we accepted it? How do we show God's grace within our lives? It brings up that analogy about a gift. When someone gives you a gift, when do you really receive it? When they hand it to you, or when you open it and put it to use? Have we truly lived God's grace in our lives? Do we truly express the fact that we are saved, that we are people of God, that we have a God who loves us, even when we don't deserve it? Do we live our lives as those people who and express to others of what we believe? You see, or do we just go out and do the things that need to be done and not follow God's will in our lives? Have we surrendered our will to His so that we can begin to listen to Him? Listen to the call that He has for each and every one of us. And it's never too late to start listening to God's call. It's never too late to start allowing God's will to run our lives. Because that's how we express that grace. That's how we learn to receive that grace that God has given us so freely. And it's always there for us. Whenever we fall, we get back up and God's grace is there to help us. But do we really accept it? Have we really decided that God is there for me and that I am going to be His follower, His disciple? Am I going to be a disciple of Jesus Christ because of everything He did for me? Have we finally made that decision? What might the world be like if we stopped working for God's grace and just accepted it and started to live the life that God is calling us to live? What would the world be like? Might we decide to be those type of people that God calls us to be? You know, in the Why We Worship video this week, Father Mark asked that question. What might be different in the world should we accept God's grace? Should we stop trying to work for God's grace and mercy? What would the world be like? How would my life might change if I learned to accept God's love? How might I change the world by accepting God's grace? You see, the readings today challenge us to take that extra step, just as Lent has challenged us to change the things in our lives that need to be changed. What might I do to become a better person? What might I do to express my faith and my love for God to those people that I meet every day? You see, the challenge is posed to us. You see, God has done everything He can for us, and He waits for us. You know, one of the expressions that always kind of blows me away is that God loved us first, and He's waiting for us to love Him back. What might our lives be like if we just learned to love Him back? What might our lives be like should we just learn to accept His grace?